Thanks, Emily. Good morning. Just a few comments before I get into my remarks. One aspect of the comments from Emily that I just want to highlight, this oil spill, as well as we're about to celebrate the anniversary of Katrina and Rita hurricanes in 2005, it's this whole sense of regionalism, how we work together from a Gulf of Mexico regional concept. And this sort of experiment, if you will, of the different Sea Grant programs putting together this one cohesive and coherent sort of approach to working together in outreach across the entire Gulf of Mexico, splitting up into different disciplines, but then trying to be one unit that helps with the outreach program. It's actually been a very interesting, and I applaud Steve and the group with what they've been able to do, and also the NEARS program. You've been doing the same thing, bringing your groups together. So I hope some of my comments actually reinforce why that's so important relative to the issues that we deal with. So I was asked in 15 minutes, I can look at my watch here, so people know me, that's going to challenge. So in 15 minutes to sort of reflect, so this is really not based on any publications per se, but some of my experiences related to to the Deepwater Horizon. I know we're not to spend time on this, but I do just want to reemphasize this began April 20th. The Monday of that week, I was actually appointed part-time chief scientist for CPRA in Louisiana. 50% of my time from LSU was dedicated to CPRA. Bad timing. Friday of that week, we're in the midst of the largest oil spill in the history of the U.S. And so part of my comments are going to be based on my reflections relative to this experience and some of the aspects I think hopefully will help support some of the discussion. So I want to talk about how we changed our thinking to a certain degree, and the role of an event like this, as well as the hurricanes, that make us think about the ecosystem itself and how we manage the ecosystem and how we describe and actually do outreach about this ecosystem. So here's an image, and this is a first image we sort of ran to first 48 hours following the spill. And what you'll notice in this image is that relative to how oil may, bait and transport and effects, is totally inaccurate related to what really is the source of the oil, not from the surface, but from the bottom. And so this whole idea of actually how to deal with the spill within the first 48 hours, sitting up in CPRA office, I got a call from a colleague from Alaska and started telling me exactly what my next 2 years were going to be like related to the paradigms of dealing with oil spill and recovery and lawyers and a whole bit. Well, I'm sorry, any lawyers out there. But this was a major paradigm shift, this whole idea that in fact oil was released from the bottom, travels 5,000 feet, and the other aspect is that when it gets to the surface it's different. It's not refined oil, it's actually natural oil from the bottom. And the fact that the oil from the surface when it hits the shoreline is very different. There were some real rock stars, I think, in outreach. Ed Overton is one that I thought did a fabulous job of describing the fact of the constituents and how the chemistry of the oil changed from when it reaches the surface to the time it hits the shoreline. The talks today, if I'm correct, are to focus on the shoreline and the wetlands, and so it's a very different aspect. But this is a simple diagram, but a major paradigm shift into how we think about oil and effects in the environment. This idea that the bottom not only sort of challenged us related to how the whole chemistry and the effects and the fate in the transport in a system from deep water, but it also really changed our concept of the ecological systems that it actually interacts with. And one of the toughest parts was tracing it. The whole idea of the fate related to the fact that what we see on the surface is just a small portion of what actually may have been released. Second, the other aspect that really I think was a major paradigm shift, and again one that I was personally involved with, is this idea of the connection between the shelf and the shoreline. I remember 2 years before the oil spill trying to get funding for a group of modelers, coastal modelers at LSU to actually look at transport mechanisms from the shelf up into the estuaries. In fact, was told, well, no, really we don't need that because there is no interaction between the shelf to the shoreline and the estuaries, and that there are two separate aspects. And this idea of fine-scale modeling using FPCOM, for example, to get from the offshore deep water and transport mechanisms and interaction in the estuaries was not of interest. But we learned, that was one of the major, I think, paradigm shifts, is this connection is something that far offshore at that depth can actually interact with the shoreline. So these ecosystems and the coupling and the fate and we know, many of you Earls out there, the biology, we know there's this migratory patterns that connect these systems, but water transport can move things around. And that was a major shift, and we had to explain that actually to the public, and that was a real challenge. Third, one of the biggest challenges I found talking to the press and talking actually to managers is trying to explain an oil spill that was occurring at one spot and translating that into ecosystem impacts across the Gulf of Mexico, when in fact, the Gulf of Mexico is probably one of the most diverse shorelines as far as ecosystem development of any shoreline compared to Atlantic or Pacific for sure. In fact, I'll put it up for a 1,000-mile shoreline, I'll put it up against any shoreline in the world related to its biodiversity. And the reason for that, just simply on the bottom right there, a simple diagram by Boyd, that actually shows different coastal setting types from deltas to estuaries to lagoons, and may I throw in there carbonate coral environments that go from subtropical to warm temperate, that actually go from wet to dry. Trying to say what oil is going to do to the ecosystems of the Gulf of Mexico is a real problem. And to just emphasize that again, is that we go from, in a short distance, from muddy coast to sandy beaches. And I can tell you, and most of you out there know very well, and I'm assuming that most of the publications will hopefully embrace this, that any generalization relative to the impacts of oil in the Gulf of Mexico ecosystems is a real challenge, because of the way that these ecosystems, particularly just the microbial communities in a sandy beach versus a muddy environment, will actually interact and process oil. And then that also means recovery and restoration. You can't take one recovery and restoration approach, and that's for, say, sandy beaches, and apply that to a muddy coast. So this idea, and what we really struggled with for the first several weeks, was how we actually try to articulate the different approaches related to what may be fate and effects and what should be a response, when in fact you're moving across this diversity of the shoreline. Fourth point, we're doing this, or we're a working coast, we're a working Gulf. Just look at the commerce that moves through the Gulf of Mexico. Just look at the oil and gas and energy, 1/3 of the domestic oil supply, and just look at the fisheries. Just take those three industries, and let's add refining, and make it 4, okay? 4 industries that rank globally and are of tremendous significance to the United States, means that we have ecosystems that are in highly engineered landscapes. So when we talk about effects and the fate of oil, how do we put that in the context of a highly engineered landscape that's already under tremendous changes related to the way we change hydrology, build canals, move sediment, add nutrients, connected to a watershed that drains 41% of the continental US, so that we are trying to add fate and effects on top of a well-stressed ecosystem that is highly engineered. How do you tease that out? How do you tell that story related to what oil is going to do, related to what may be changes that are associated with other factors? Just let me give you an example real quick here of some work that we've just finished, and actually is in publication, just went to Sustainability Science. Here's a hydrologic basins of coastal Louisiana in the Delta, Mississippi River Delta, and you'll notice the distribution of sediment in these basins, and how that distribution, again, is the byproduct of a highly engineered landscape. engineered to promote navigation and flood control. Now, what I'm going to show you are three curves. If you can see this, it's a little complicated, but I have three lines. If you look up to the upper right, there's a green line of 2000, there's a yellow line, 1970, and a white line in 1930. These are actually isoclefs that Woody Gagliano published in 1970 that represent where the 50% interaction of marsh to water would occur in coastal Louisiana. So these are locations where 50% of the landscape, of the coastal landscape, is marsh, where 50% of that landscape is water. And what he did was he actually took 7.5-minute quads from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or USGS, and took those quads, and actually the white line is calculated from that in 1930. He did this analysis in 1970, so the yellow line is observation in 1970, so the yellow and white are based on real observations. In 1970, he drew the green line, of what he anticipated would be the migration of that 50% marsh to water ratio by the year 2000. What that means is, as that line moves inland, you're getting a higher percentage of water, right, compared to marsh, because of the disappearance of the wetlands and the occurrence of water. So what I'm going to show you are three graphs where we have the Coastal Studies Institute and a group at LSU. We've actually gone back and we've actually wrote a program to actually query images to actually check exactly how well this model that Gagliano did. And now, since he predicted this observation in 2000, we actually have the luxury of testing it, because we're here in 2015. So let's start. First, this is an image, and I'll explain this image. So I've superimposed first Gagliano's lines, his isoclasts, right? Now this is an image in 1932. Now the dark green means that there is higher amount of marsh compared to water. The light green means the marsh to water ratio is about 50% or less, and the black is 100% water. And you'll notice what's very interesting is that right around that 1930 yellow line pretty well fits this 1932 image. If you go to the 1973 image, and now we're referencing the 1970 yellow line of Gagliano, it's actually not so bad either. That this comparison between the technique that Woody used and what we're using actually line up very well. But you can see the slight migration across the coast, Barataria Basin compared to Terrebonne, but very little migration in Mid-Chapelot. We go to the next image. This is an image in 1999. So now we're looking at an image that actually Woody projected over a 30-year time frame. And for those, I don't have a point, well, I guess I do, right? So here's Terrebonne. What's very interesting, so here's his red line of 2000, and here's actually that marsh to water ratio of 50%. What's very interesting is Terrebonne actually response was greater than what Woody suggested. And Barataria is actually less than what Woody had projected. He had projected a line all the way up here in Barataria, and a higher migration rate, if you will, of water relative to marsh in Breton Sound. When you look at the 2010 image, again, what you're seeing here is the Gulf of Mexico migrating inland, right, relative to marsh and converting wetlands to water. Look how much farther in Terrebonne, and again up in Barataria, slowly the Gulf of Mexico is migrating, actually slowly at a relatively rapid pace. And I guess those are all relative terms we could argue about. But again, this point is that we are looking at any point in time, an event such as an oil spill in a highly engineered landscape that is dramatically changing. So again, how do we tell this story about oil when in fact we're talking about an ecosystem that is drastically changing related to the way we manage and engineer that landscape? Finally, my last comment is that one of the biggest struggles we had, and these are some images that are very dear or very obvious to many of you, is response and recovery and how we deal with the event while it happens. And we actually wrote up about a 15-20 page, we being CPRA on behalf of the state, wrote up what we thought would be response recommendations relative to the spill. And when it comes to individual species, and particularly top species in the food chain, hands-on responses were very effective, and those stories have really caught the attention of the public. When it comes to actually the ecosystems and the marsh surface, this became really problematic. And that is this concept of do no harm. And I'm telling you, I guess of all the conversations I had during the spill, and for those of you who are involved in a response, I know it's an extremely sensitive topic, but this idea of actually what we physically do as far as cleanup versus what the ecosystem can do itself, I hope that actually is something that we can work on and becomes a major part of the results of the research and projects that are going on. My last point is where the oil is going to go and the geography of oil, because where the new paradigms are going to be related to where oil exploration goes. So what we learned from an oil event here, how well does that actually capture this idea that an event could happen further to the west? So let me just summarize. First, fate and effects, new paradigms. Again, this is a release of oil from the bottom. Helping the Gulf of Mexico ecosystems from the shelf to the shore, major paradigms, shifts there, new paradigms I'm sure will be discovered, and this will be refined. Scaling the effects across diverse Gulf of Mexico ecosystems, telling that story of fate and effect when you can go from a muddy coast to a sandy beach and to a carbonate corals is a real challenge. Recovery in highly engineered landscapes, what is your baseline? From baselines to benchmarks. This is going to be a real challenge. And then finally, do no harm, how to reconcile response, and how do we deal with the aspects of what ecosystems can do on their own versus how we actually should be actively involved in remediation. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope some of those comments help you during the day. Thanks.